Today, on the Word Preacher Podcast, Bad Omens, Restoration, and a little bit of history in the middle of Isaiah. I'm Brett Jensen, and this is the Word Preacher Podcast. Alright, our Come Follow Me curriculum for this coming week will bring us to Isaiah 13 through 39. The official Come Follow Me breaks it up a little bit and skips some things, but you should read it all. It's good. You should read it all. Let's start, though, by talking about something that doesn't seem very good. Let's go to some reading in Isaiah 13, 6 through 10. That says this: Howl ye, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It shall come as a destruction from the Almighty. Therefore shall all hands be faint, and every man's heart shall melt. And they shall be afraid. Pangs and sorrows shall take hold of them, and they shall be in pain as a woman that travaileth. They shall be amazed one at another. Their faces shall be as flames. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, cruel both with wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate. And he shall destroy the sinners thereof out of it. For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. Yeah, that sounds bad. We've got these passages here that kind of talk about these disasters that are coming. And sometimes it's easy to look at the stuff that was going on in the life of Isaiah and think, oh yeah, well, they really did deal with that. When Ahaz was king and there were enemies of Judah surrounding them and triumphing over them on every side, there was pain. Everyone was shocked. They had been a strong kingdom and prevailed against kind of, long odds. But in the reign of Ahaz, when they turned away from the Lord, it turned upside down. Judah was made low because of that. Of course, this isn't just about that. The imagery of the stars falling from heaven and the constellations not giving their light, the moon shall be darkened. This should seem familiar if you've studied some of the New Testament prophecies, both by Jesus Christ and also by John the Divine as apostle, talking about things that would accompany the last days. That's not exactly great circumstances to be in, particularly because we're in the last days. But if you look around, we've got some crazy stuff going on. Those who watch and pray will be empowered to see these signs and recognize them for what they are. Isaiah 13 is a chapter, as we're moving along, that describes itself as the burden of Babylon. And just a little historical context on this. The old Babylonian Empire, there had been, in the Bronze Age, a kingdom of Babylon that was strong. But during the late Bronze Age collapse, it kind of shrunk down to almost nothing. The peoples were wiped out. Really, the only kingdom that was able to survive was Egypt. And later, we do see an emergence of several of the kingdoms that were big during the Bronze Age, like Assyria and Babylon. But sometimes scholars will use the term Neo in front of it, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, to describe that this is the new rise of those powers, or the powers in those regions after the Bronze Age collapse. This was the true age of empires. So that's something to be aware of as you're examining the history of this time. This is Isaiah was living in the age of empires. So they were in the process of rising to power. Babylon had not realized its height. Assyria was the big true empire, and they had strength over everyone. No one could stop Assyria. In fact, later, at the end, after there's some drama that we'll get to later, King Hezekiah ends up showing messengers from Babylon some of the treasures of his kingdom. He's friendly towards this small kingdom out in the Chaldees. And Isaiah warned that, he probably should not have shown all of those things to the Babylonians. They would possess all of them. They would take them to Babylon. Of course, century later, Judah makes an alliance with Egypt against King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon instead of trusting in God. Egypt does not save them, and they, as Isaiah predicted, are carried off in a great destruction off to Babylon. So even though Babylon's power was trending up, Isaiah prophesied ultimate ruin for them. So what people were observing with Babylon, in a small degree, they might think, oh yeah, they're becoming a bigger kingdom. They're having success. And Isaiah said, that's not going to last. Even though he also knew that they were going to come and take all of the treasures away. And I think that's an important point, that these world powers, these big world events that attract a lot of attention and seem really important right now, really urgent, they might not be important in the long run. Okay, let's read a couple more verses. Isaiah chapter 14, 24 and 25. The Lord of hosts hath sworn, saying, surely as I have thought, so shall it come to pass, and as I have purposed, so shall it stand, that I will break the Assyrian in my land, and upon my mountains tread him under foot. Then shall his yoke depart from off them, and his burden depart from off their shoulders. If we skip down a little bit further, starting in 29, it continues, rejoice not thou, whole Palestina, because the rod of him that smote thee is broken. For out of the serpent's root shall come forth the cockatrice, and his fruit shall be a fiery flying serpent. And the firstborn of the poor shall feed, and the needy shall lie down in safety, and I will kill thy root with famine, and he shall slay thy remnant. Howl, O gate, cry, O city, thou whole Palestina art dissolved. For there shall come from the north a smoke, and none shall be alone in his appointed times. So this term Palestine is related to the concept of the Philistines, who would become the inhabitants of this area by Tyre and Sidon, like the Phoenician areas and the places out by the coasts. That could be considered the Palestine to which Isaiah was referring. The Philistines were going to have a reprieve from the Assyrian dominance over them, but it wasn't going to last. You don't really hear about the Philistines much later. They were taken out. So there is this prophecy based on whoever seems strong. Keep in mind, that doesn't necessarily last. And that becomes really important in the big picture. If we look at these verses, we see a notable comparison. This is Isaiah 14, 12 through 15 that reads, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit." So this reference is obviously to Satan, to Lucifer. The devil also has times when he seems to be trending up. He seems to be doing well. He's going to have a reprieve, and he's got a moment where it looks like evil is going to triumph. What can men do against such reckless hatred? As Theoden observed. Isaiah is very clear. He foretells that there will be utter ruin, permanent punishment for Satan's rebellion against God. Certainly he might appear powerful and puffed up at the moment, and he's not someone to be underestimated or to be dismissed as though he has no influence over us. But keep in mind, he's not going to win. Choose your side correctly. All right. A third with Assyria and Egypt. Let's look at this concept that Isaiah predicts here, which I think is fascinating. This is in Isaiah 19, starting in verse 20, which reads, "And it shall be for a sign and for a witness unto the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. For they shall cry unto the Lord because of their oppressors, and he shall send them a Savior, and a great one, and he shall deliver them. And the Lord shall be known to Egypt, and the Egyptians shall know the Lord in that day, and shall do sacrifice and oblation. Yea, they shall vow a vow unto the Lord, and perform it. And the Lord shall smite Egypt, he shall smite and heal it. And they shall return even to the Lord, and he shall be entreated of them, and shall heal them. In that day there shall be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian shall come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptians shall serve with the Assyrians. And in that day shall Israel be the third with Egypt and with Assyria, even a blessing in the midst of the land." This is really notable because Egypt and Assyria were considered some of the great powers during the days of Isaiah. Assyria was the unstoppable empire in the north, and Egypt, they had endured even the Bronze Age. They were still around. They were also separated from one another by a great distance. And that had been kind of a barrier. Egypt really hadn't had the northern influence that they had during the Bronze Age. Isaiah uses these nations as a type for the great nations of the world that will come to know the Messiah and be healed. So it's not necessarily that that Egypt and Assyria were going to, this wasn't a prediction that those empires were going to become converted to the religion of Judah. This is a concept about these great national powers would accept Christ. And also there is a literal element to what will happen in the land when the Savior returns and makes it pure. That part of the world is going to be healed in real and literal ways. And then to consider Israel as a part of this is also important. This is not Judah that's named, even though he lived in the southern kingdom, Isaiah that is, and Isaiah lived to see the northern tribes taken away. He didn't specify Judah. He specified all Israel in the restoration. And this is interesting to see juxtaposed with chapter 20 of Isaiah that predicts the miserable downfall of Egypt to the Assyrians, which is less a type and more an actual event that was being predicted. So it's important to kind of get a handle on what was going on in that time and understand that sometimes there are symbolic representations of powers and sometimes it's literal. And a lot of times with Isaiah, it's both. All right, let's do some more reading in Isaiah 24. This is starting in verse 19. The earth is utterly broken down. The earth is clean dissolved. The earth is moved exceedingly. The earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and shall be removed like a cottage. And the transgression thereof shall be heavy upon it. And it shall fall and not rise again. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall punish the host of the high ones that are on high, and the kings of the earth upon the earth. And they shall be gathered together as prisoners are gathered in the pit, and shall be shut up in the prison, and after many days shall they be visited. Then the moon shall be confounded, and the sun ashamed, when the Lord of hosts shall reign in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and before his ancients gloriously. So we have a prediction here. Even though there's a lot of vivid imagery, you kind of get the gist of this. This should seem familiar. The earth is going to be in a bad spot. The powerful on earth will fail. And in spite of calamity kind of taking hold, the one who will save us will appear. Jesus Christ. You should search as you're looking through Isaiah for signs of Jesus Christ. That is a key to understanding what he's talking about. All right, let's do a little more reading talking about restoration. Isaiah says in verses 13 and 14, "Wherefore the Lord said, Forasmuch as this people draw near me with their mouth, and with their lips do honor me, but have removed their heart far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the precept of men. Therefore, behold, I will proceed to do a marvelous work among this people, even a marvelous work and a wonder. For the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the understanding of their prudent men shall be hid." You could look at that situation that accompanied the great religious revival in the early 1800s. People were inspired to try to find God, but there was great confusion. People drawing near to him with their lips, but they don't know how to put their hearts with him. Learned people were not the source of truth. Instead, an uneducated farm boy was directed to bring forth an incredible and true account, untouched by scholars or scribes or anyone who might alter it, and to translate it by the power of God. Of course, this is the Book of Mormon, and it has brought millions to Christ. Here's another fascinating prophecy that Isaiah gives in Isaiah 29, verses 11 and 12. "And the vision of all is become unto you as the words of a book that is sealed, which men deliver to one that is learned, saying, Read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I cannot, for it is sealed. And the book is delivered to him that is not learned, saying, Read this, I pray thee. And he saith, I am not learned." Okay, so we have a couple of characters in this prophecy. You have a person who is unable to read something from this book, and you have a guy who is learned, but he can't read the book because it's sealed. Now, this parallels to an account that took place where Martin Harris, one of the three witnesses to the Book of Mormon, brought with him some transcribed characters from the golden plates to a Professor Charles Anthon. He was a linguist who had studied not only Greek and Latin, but also ancient American languages, which is kind of important. He wasn't, he didn't have this idea that it was Reformed Egyptian yet. They were looking to see, it must be ancient American languages. So according to Martin Harris, Professor Anthon gave him a signed certificate of authenticity, but when he learned that Joseph had obtained the plates by an angel, he ripped it up and suggested that Harris bring the plates to him to be translated. Harris answered that part of the book was sealed, and Anthon answered, "I cannot read a sealed book." Though Anthon tried later to deny that he had ever signed a certificate and only suggested that Harris get the plates translated, what's painfully obvious in the historical record is that after his visit, Harris was more confident than ever that this work was inspired by God, that it was a fulfillment of this prophecy. And that's notable. Of course, the prophecy by Isaiah was fulfilled with this meeting. He knew that the Lord would bring forth a powerful witness in the Book of Mormon. All right. Let's go ahead and take a couple of minutes, even though we've talked about this in previous podcasts. There's a bit of history that's in the middle of the book of Isaiah. It kind of sneaks up on you. You have all of this poetic prophecy in the beginning and towards the end, and right in the middle there's this historical account of Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, who's expanding his empire, and he has assembled a huge army, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. It's more than any of these little cities or nations could withstand. And their strategy was actually quite effective in terms of conquest. They come with an unstoppable force, and you can either fight them and die, or you can be relocated. They break up these local cultures and the ties to the land and populate it with other people. And then that makes everybody kind of forced to assimilate. And they define that assimilation as Assyria. Well, there were some problems with this, like the Lord didn't want that to happen. So, when Rabshakeh, who's the leader of these Assyrians, comes up to Jerusalem during the reign of Hezekiah, he's very confident in his position. He doesn't even bother talking directly to the king. He talks to the men who are out fighting and says, don't let your king Hezekiah trick you into thinking that your God will save you. Where are the gods of this city or this city? Where are the gods of Israel? Where's the God of Sepharvaim? Where's the God of Gath? Where are the gods of Syria? They couldn't save them. Don't be an idiot. You will die if you resist. And Hezekiah goes to the temple and he prays to the Lord. And this is what he says. O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, that dwellest between the cherubims, thou art the God, even thou alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. Thou hast made heaven and earth. Incline thine ear, O Lord, and hear. Open thine eyes, O Lord, and see, and hear all the words of Sennacherib, which hath sent to reproach the living God. Of a truth, Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste all the nations and their countries, and have cast their gods into the fire. For they were no gods, but the works of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore have they destroyed them. Now therefore, O Lord our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that thou art the Lord, even thou only. That's Isaiah 37:15 through 20. The faith that Hezekiah demonstrated allowed the Lord to come and help. During the night, an angel slew 185,000 Assyrians. That is a ridiculously large number of dead. Not to anyone's surprise, they left Judah. and it remained for another century before it was destroyed by Babylon. The preservation of Judah was vital. It meant the preservation of the scriptures, of faith in God, of what happened with Moses. It meant the preservation of the life and the words of the prophet Isaiah, the prophet that Jesus heavily quoted, loved, and exhorted us to study. In the end, Isaiah knew firsthand about the miraculous power of the Lord to save, even when confronting a seeming impossible obstacle. And even after the inevitable destruction that will come in the last days, the same God will establish a peace that has not been known since the days of Eden. We appreciate all the support for the Word Preacher podcast. Next week, we'll look at Isaiah 40 through 49. There is a mountain of stuff we didn't get to in our discussion of these chapters. Please study that individually and with your family. And of course, as always, fight on.